Hi guys. So we're still talking about the Civil War. This week, this first article is called Identifying as an American. How did the role of the federal government change during and after the war? You may recall that in the decades before the Civil War, government officials from the South championed the cause of states' rights. Not only did they claim that states had the authority to secede from the Union or leave the Union, but they also asserted states' powers to nullify federal laws and preserve the institution of slavery. The Union's victory in the Civil War did not end the rallying cry of states' rights, but it did establish the supremacy of the federal government over the states. It also affirmed the status of the U.S. Constitution as the supreme law of the land. In the years during and following the war, the federal government began to play a greater role in the lives of individual Americans. Okay, so this is just saying that in the Civil War, um, during the Civil War, the South was, as we know, was saying states don't have to stay in; they can leave the Union. It's fine. Obviously, the Union won the war, and that gave the government a little more power um, in the individual roles of our lives as Americans. So it didn't give them supreme power. It does, but not really. So they have the power over our lives, but states still have their own individual rights. Okay, so that's why, like, we have our governor Larry Hogan, and the state of Florida has their own governor, and the state of Delaware has their own governor. Okay, so so states' rights are still established, but the government as a whole rules over Americans. And at the end of the Civil War, they did have a little bit of a greater hand over us. The war increased not only the power of the federal government, but also its size, its functions, and its budget. When the Civil War began in 1861, the federal government exercised little real power over day to day life. Most government functions were handled at the state and local level. Outside of postal workers, the federal government had fewer than 6,000 employees in 1861. In contrast, today's federal government employs roughly 2 million people. Okay, so the Civil War, at the end of it, the federal government got bigger. Its budget got bigger, its functions got bigger, it got bigger in size. There used to be 6,000 employees in the federal government in 1861, and now there's 2 million. I'm sure everybody in this class knows someone who has a family member who is employed by the government. The main factor causing the government to expand was the war itself. Congress needed to pay soldiers and provide food and weapons for them. The Legal Tender Act of 1862 authorized the Treasury to print 450 million in greenbacks. These were notes or paper money that represented debts of the government but were not redeemable in gold or silver. Some of these notes went to the newly created Bureau of Pensions. Congress created this office to manage payments to wounded soldiers and to the wives and families of the dead. During the war, Congress also created the Department of Agriculture to ensure the nation's and the Army's food supply. After the war, this office was given responsibility for helping Southern farmers restore their productivity. During the Civil War years, the federal government also spent money building universities, creating infrastructure in Western territories, and laying the foundation for a railroad system that would eventually stretch across the United States. Okay, so they made these greenbacks, and the greenbacks was paper money. Okay, so a lot of these greenbacks or notes, they went to the Bureau of Pension. Okay, Congress actually created this Bureau of Pension in order to help take care of the wounded soldiers and their wives. Okay, they would make payments. Um, they would make payments from the government to wounded soldiers' families. Okay, they also had the Department of Agriculture was created during this time to help ensure the Army's food supply. We talked about how their food supply kind of plummeted during the war because they couldn't work the land. They didn't have everything that they need, okay? So, and after the war, this Department of Agriculture, they helped the southern states kind of rebuild their farms. Nationalism. Accompanying the growth of the federal government was the emergence of nationalism, or a sense of loyalty and connections to the nation as a whole. During the Civil War, Americans from outside the South began to see and identify themselves as citizens of the United States more than as citizens of their home states. The song, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, became famous among the Union Army. By singing this patriotic song together, the soldiers felt united under a common cause. After all, following the leadership of President Abraham Lincoln, people from different states had joined together to save the Union and end slavery. As a result, people from different regions of the country felt more connected to one another and to the nation as a whole. In addition, because the federal government was beginning to play an increased role in their lives, Americans began looking to the president as their leader. Okay, so with the war, the Civil War, came the growth of the government, which we just talked about, and also nationalism. So nationalism just means a loyalty or a connection to the nation. Okay, so when the states were first founded, states originally, and we talked about this at the beginning of the year, states identified themselves like as their own private like union. Okay, and you were a Floridian or a Marylander, which we still are, but we look at ourselves as part of the United States, and that loyalty to the United States and not just your home state really became more prevalent or more apparent during the Civil War. Okay, so it was because these people are looking at President Lincoln. President Lincoln was leading the Civil War. He was really in charge. He watched everyone kind of join together. The country watched everyone join together to end slavery. So people started feeling more connected to the United States as a whole and not just their individual state. It's also when Americans really began looking at the president as a leader.